My name is Ethan, and I was a police officer in the small town of Hollowbrook before I left for good. The town had always had its fair share of ghost stories, but I never put much stock in them. That changed the night I responded to a missing person's call near Black Hollow Road. It was late October, and a thick fog had rolled into town, swallowing the streets in an eerie haze. Dispatch received a distress call from a woman claiming her husband had vanished outside their home. She was frantic, saying he had stepped outside to investigate a noise and never came back. I arrived at the house, a small cottage at the edge of the woods. The fog was so dense I could barely see my own hands. The woman, Mrs. Calloway, met me at the door, her eyes wild with fear. She kept glancing over her shoulder, as if expecting something to come out of the mist. "He was just there," she whispered, pointing toward the porch steps. I heard him call my name, and then silence. I ran outside, but there was nothing. No footprints, no sound, just gone. I tried to calm her down, assuring her that we would find her husband, but as I stepped off the porch and into the fog, a strange sensation settled over me, like the air was thicker, heavier. The world beyond the mist felt wrong. I drew my flashlight and scanned the area. The beam barely cut through the fog, illuminating only a few feet ahead. The trees loomed like skeletal figures, their branches reaching out like twisted fingers. I called Mr. Calloway's name, my voice swallowed instantly by the unnatural silence. Then I heard it. A whisper, low, distant, shifting in the mist. I turned sharply, my pulse spiking. "Mr. Calloway." No answer. The whispering grew louder. A dozen voices speaking over one another, moving through the fog. My breath hitched as I realized the sound wasn't coming from one direction, it was circling me. Then, the fog shifted. A figure emerged, standing just at the edge of my vision. My flashlight flickered, struggling to stay on. The figure was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long. It had no face, just a dark, hollow void where its features should have been. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to move. The thing tilted its head, as if studying me. Then, it raised one skeletal hand and pointed at me. The whispers turned into something worse, laughter, deep, distorted, echoing from all around me. My flashlight died, plunging me into darkness. I felt the air shift, the presence moving closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for my radio, but all I heard was static. Then, a voice cut through the noise. "You shouldn't be here." A sudden force slammed into me, knocking the air from my lungs. I hit the ground hard, pain shooting through my ribs. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I swore I saw shapes moving in the mist, twisted, contorted figures watching me, and then, silence. The fog lifted just as quickly as it had come. I gasped for air, my hands trembling as I scrambled to my feet. I was standing in the middle of the road, my cruiser idling a few feet away. The house was gone. The trees were gone. There was nothing but an empty stretch of highway behind me. I drove back to the station in a daze, my mind struggling to process what had happened. When I reported the incident, my supervisor gave me a strange look. "There's no Black Hollow Road in Hollowbrook, Ethan," I protested. But when I checked the town's maps, the road didn't exist. Neither did the Calloways, the house, the missing husband. The whispering fognin of it was real, but I know what I saw, and sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers. My name is Olivia, and I was a real estate agent before I quit my job for good. I used to think old houses were charming, filled with history and untold stories. That was before I encountered the Harper House. Harper House was an abandoned Victorian mansion in the small town of Ashwood. It had been on the market for decades, yet no one ever bought it. People in town avoided it, refusing to even look at it as they passed by. Some claimed it was haunted. Others said people who stepped inside never felt the same again. I dismissed the rumors. It was just another old house that needed the right buyer. I made an appointment to inspect it alone before listing it again. That was my first mistake. The house stood at the end of a long, winding road, surrounded by dead trees. The iron gates groaned as I pushed them open, rust flaking onto my hands. The air felt heavier as I stepped onto the front porch. The wooden boards creaked under my weight, but the house itself was silent. Too silent. I turned the key in the lock, and the door swung open with an unsettling ease. The air inside was stale, filled with the scent of dust and something else, faintly metallic. I took a cautious step inside, my footsteps echoing through the vast, empty halls. The furniture was covered in sheets, the chandeliers coated in cobwebs. But it wasn't the sight of decay that unsettled me. It was the whispering. At first I thought it was the wind slipping through the cracks in the walls. But as I moved deeper into the house, the whispers grew clearer. Faint, hushed voices, overlapping one another. Some sounded desperate, others amused. I told myself it was my imagination, maybe an old pipe hissing, or my nerves playing tricks on me. I continued my inspection, trying to ignore the growing unease curling in my stomach. Then I heard my name, a whisper, distinct from the rest, slithered through the air. Olivia. I froze. My breath hitched. The name had come from the grand staircase leading to the second floor. The air around me turned ice cold, my skin prickling with unseen static. I should have left, but something compelled me forward. I climbed the stairs, each step heavier than the last. When I reached the top, the hallway stretched unnaturally long, doors lining each side like the ribs of a great beast. Then, one of them creaked open. A bedroom. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, the furniture thick with dust. A massive mirror stood in the corner, its surface dark and rippling like water, and in it, I saw her, a woman, standing behind me. She was gaunt, her skin a sickly gray, her eyes hollow. Her mouth stretched open, forming words, but no sound came out. I turned, heart hammering, but the room was empty then. The whispers exploded, hundreds of voices, screaming, crying, laughing. The air grew dense, pressing against me like unseen hands. I stumbled back, my reflection warping in the mirror. The woman's mouth moved faster now, her expression desperate, pleading, "Get out." I ran. I don't remember how I got out of the house, but the next thing I knew, I was in my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. As I peeled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The front door of the house had shut on its own. I quit my job that night. Harper House remains unsold. No one goes near it. But sometimes, late at night, I hear it, my name, whispered through my window. My name is Daniel, and for the last 15 years, I have worked as a journalist, covering strange occurrences in small towns. I have heard my fair share of ghost stories, local legends, and bizarre tales, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered in the town of Ravenshade. It all started with a tip about a town where people were vanishing without a trace. No signs of struggle, no explanations, just entire families gone overnight. The locals refused to talk to outsiders, and those who did only whispered about the faceless ones. At first, I thought it was just another urban legend. I was wrong. I arrived in Ravenshade on a foggy evening, the streets eerily quiet. The town was unsettling. The houses were old and decrepit, and despite the town's size, I saw no children playing, no people walking around. It felt abandoned, yet I could sense eyes watching me from behind the tattered curtains. I checked into the only motel in town and decided to walk around before nightfall. As I explored, I found faded missing person posters pinned to telephone poles. Some so old the paper had nearly disintegrated. One caught my eye. It was dated over 20 years ago, yet the ink looked fresh. Then, I saw him. A man stood on the corner of the street, his back turned to me. He wore a dark overcoat, his posture unnaturally stiff. Something about him felt wrong. I hesitated before calling out, "Excuse me, sir, you live here?" Slowly, the man turned, my stomach dropped. He had no face, no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just smooth, pale skin where his features should have been. My breath hitched as I stumbled backward. The man nor whatever. He was cocked his head, as if confused by my reaction. Then, from the houses around me, others began to step out. One by one, they emerged from the shadows. Dozens of them, their faceless heads tilting in unnatural synchronization. They did not speak, did not move, just stared at me with an empty, suffocating presence. I turned and ran. My heart pounded as I sprinted back toward the motel. The air around me thickening, pressing against my chest. The farther I ran, the more the town seemed to twist and shift. The streets changed, stretching unnaturally, houses rearranging themselves like a living maze. I reached the motel and slammed the door behind me, locking it with trembling hands. My breath came in ragged gasps. Had I imagined it? Was I losing my mind? Then, I heard the whisper. Right outside my window, I turned slowly, dread curling in my gut. The faceless man was standing there, inches from the glass, his featureless face pressed against it. Though he had no mouth, I swear I could hear him breathing. Then, in a voice that was not a voice, he spoke inside my head. "You should not have come." Darkness swallowed me whole. I woke up in my car, parked at the edge of town. My notepad was gone, my phone wiped clean. The town of Ravenshade was nowhere to be found. Where it should have been, there was only an empty stretch of road, and an old rusted sign that read, "Town limits Ravenshadista Baltus, never." My name is Eric, and I made the worst mistake of my life when I decided to take a shortcut through Hollowbrook. It was supposed to be a quiet little town, just a few miles off the highway. I'd never heard of it before, but the map showed a direct route leading through it. I was behind schedule, exhausted, and eager to get home, so I took the turn without thinking twice. I arrived just before sunset. The town looked off. The streets were too clean, the houses perfectly aligned, and every single lawn was precisely trimmed. But the strangest thing, there were no people. No children playing, no cars moving, no voices, just absolute silence. I slowed my car to a crawl, rolling past rows of identical houses. Each one had its curtains drawn, as if the town itself was holding its breath. The place felt frozen in time. My fingers tightened on the steering wheel. Something about it made my skin prickle with unease. Still, I convinced myself it was just an old, forgotten town. Nothing sinister. Maybe the residents had moved away, or maybe it was one of those places where everyone turned in early. I spotted what looked like a gas station up ahead. The neon sign buzzed weakly, flickering in the dimming light. I pulled up beside the pump, but as I stepped out of the car, I noticed the pumps were rusted, the price per gallon outdated by at least a decade. The glass door of the station was covered in dust, and through it, I could see rows of empty shelves inside. No cashier, no sign of life. Then, I saw movement. A figure stood at the end of the street, barely visible in the fading light. My breath hitched. I waved, hoping for some reassurance that I wasn't alone, but the figure didn't wave back. They just stood there, watching. A chill crept up my spine. Something about the way they stood too still, too rigid made my stomach twist. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I decided to leave. Maybe it was just a strange, abandoned town, and I had no business being there. But as I turned the car around, my headlights illuminated something that made my blood run cold. More figures, dozens of them, standing on porches, sidewalks, in the middle of the street, all facing me, all UNMOVING. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel. I pressed the gas, heart hammering, but the car wouldn't move. The engine sputtered and died. I fumbled with the key, desperate to restart it. Then I heard it, a whisper, not from the outside, from the back seat. I turned, my breath caught in my throat. A woman sat there. Her face was pale and hollow, her eyes black as the night. She wore a faded, tattered dress, her hands resting lifelessly in her lap. Her lips barely moved as she whispered, "You shouldn't have come." I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. The figures outside had started to move slowly, unnaturally, their heads tilting at odd angles as they advanced toward the car. Their footsteps made no sound, but the air around me seemed to thicken, pressing in like an unseen force. I yanked at the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The woman in the back seat didn't move. She just kept whispering, over and over, "You shouldn't have come." The streetlights flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw something beyond the figures, a shadow, taller than the rest, its form twisting unnaturally. Its presence alone sent a wave of nausea through me. I felt my vision blurred. Then everything went dark. I don't know how long I was unconscious, but when I woke up, I was still in my car. The engine was running, the radio playing static. The town was gone. I was back on the highway, miles from where I had last been. The road ahead was empty, stretching into the distance like nothing had happened. But when I checked the time, only a minute had passed, and in my rearview mirror, just for a second, I saw her dot sitting in my back seat, smiling. My name is Adam, and I grew up in the quiet town of Blackwood. Nestled between dense forests and mist-covered hills, it was the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to change. But there was one thing that set Blackwood apart from any other town: the old bell tower at the center of Blackwood Square. The tower was ancient, built over a century ago, with a rusting iron bell that hadn't rung in decades. The town elders always said it was broken, but we, the kids, knew better. Legends whispered through the town, passed down from generation to generation. They said the bell didn't ring for the passing of time, it rang for the passing of souls. And when it did, someone in town would disappear. I never believed the stories. I thought they were just old ghost tales meant to scare kids into staying away from the unstable structure. That is, until the night I heard it ring. It was a cold autumn evening, the wind howling through the empty streets. I had just finished my shift at the diner and was walking home, cutting through the town square. The moon hung low, casting eerie shadows across the cobblestone paths. The tower loomed over me, its presence unsettling, even though I had passed it 1,000 times before. Then, the air around me grew unnaturally still. The wind stopped. The distant hum of cicadas ceased. It was as if the entire town was holding its breath, and then it came. A single, deep chime rang out, echoing through the empty streets. My body went rigid. The sound vibrated in my bones, filling me with a primal fear I had never felt before. I turned toward the tower, my breath hitching in my throat, and that's when I saw him. A figure stood at the base of the tower, half shrouded in the shadows. He was tall, his frame draped in an old-fashioned coat, a dusty hat casting his face in darkness. But even in the dim light, I could see his grin, unnatural, stretching too far across his face. Then, he moved. One slow step forward. I wanted to run, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. The bell tolled again, louder this time, reverberating through my skull. The figure took another step, then another, his movements unnatural, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. I finally broke free from my paralysis and stumbled backward. My breath came in ragged gasps as I turned and ran, sprinting through the square, my heart hammering in my chest. Behind me, the bell rang a third time. The last thing I remember was that awful grin, stretching wider, his face distorting, as the shadows swallowed him whole. Then, everything went black. When I woke up, I was in my bed. My mother was at my side, eyes red and puffy. My father standing at the door, pale as a ghost. They told me I had been missing for 3 days. But the worst part, the bell tower was gone. Not just the sound, the entire structure, as if it had never existed. I asked my parents, my friends, the town elders. No one remembered it. There was no record of it in the town's history, no pictures, no remnants of the foundation. It was like it had been erased from existence. Yet, every night, at exactly midnight, I still hear it. A single, deep chime echoing in the darkness, ringing just for me. And sometimes, if I listen closely, I hear footsteps outside my bedroom door.